Dice are rolling, darkness falls. Inside the GM Studios halls. Tabletop games where nightmares creep. In a realm where sanity is lost and weak. Welcome to the abyss where dreams shatter. Inside the GM Studio, nothing else matters. Blood and chaos, the dark arts unfold. In the realm of role-playing, where legends are told.
Hey there, gang. Welcome back to the side question episode of Inside the GM Studio. We straight ass be answering questions from the mofo internet like it was something to do. I am your host, David.
I'm Matt.
And let's see what we get this week. We get a 4 this week, Matt.
4.
The roll of the die is a 4. Matt's going to give me a hot take.
Oh, wow. All right.
Oh, wow.
It's a very short one. This one comes from Allamatter on our Ask Game Masters with the title Raw vs. Ray. Raw vs. Ray. RAI. As a DM, I'm always the type to take a moment when a rules question comes up and try to figure out the RAI. Or for you out there that don't know, rules as intended. If that's not possible, I default to RAW, or rules as written, instead of something like the rule of cool. Sorry. With that being said, I've been playing in a game where the DM is always going for strict rules as written, even in edge cases that were not clarified in the rules. What do you think about always going with Raw versus Ray?
Yeah, this is a tension between GMs and players a lot of the times, and as we discussed on the main show, it can be one of the things that turns you off from playing in a certain game or turns you off from having certain players in your game if you're the kind of person that runs a game.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be some symmetry with that dynamic. That said, the GM should be the arbiter of where that slider is. I guess I would say that it's better to kind of defend the questioner's GM a little bit. It's better to be a generally rules as written player as opposed to be a generally rules as intended player.
Mm-hmm.
Because here's why. Unless you assume the writers of the rules are idiots and they don't know how to communicate what it is they intend, you're just playing 3D chess with yourself by trying to kind of get into their heads when it's like these, especially for games like D&D, which is, I don't know if he mentioned whether he's a D&D player or what.
I don't know. He says they say DM, so I'm guessing Dungeon Master. Or
Okay,
D&D.
so for D&D, for Call of Cthulhu, for Shadowrun, more well-established Savage Worlds, these more well-established game sets that have been around for a while, VTM, we're not talking about like a hodgepodge of like 5 guys who are just kind of shooting from the hip, and maybe didn't have as much time to kind of go through R&D, let's call it. But D&D goes through tons of readings and tons of copy edits and tons of beta tests before it ever makes it to you. So unless you're just going to assume that you're going to figure out the intention that's not there on the page, you're probably not reading closely enough.
Mm-hmm.
Read closely.
Plus,
D&D
I find that it can go rules as written first if you always do rules as written, which I think is like, that's my default, is rules as written first.
Exactly.
Because it can go rules as written doesn't seem to make sense, so rules as intended, you kind of figure it out. But I think if you flip-flop it, it doesn't work out as well.
No, you're trying too hard to get in the head of
Yeah.
the rules creators, and it just creates bedlam because you're just
Hmm.
basically making the assumption they don't know how to communicate their intent that well. When what I'm saying is that they work at Wizards of the Coast because they do know how to do that, at least in
Right.
part. They're not going to be able to encapsulate every edge case, like you said. It's often not even an edge case because when you read a rule, it is pretty straightforward. It's till you start layering over a specific thing, fucking bug. You layer over a specific like new power or new spell or whatever. Like, how does it bump up against this rule? And that's when it gets confusing. This is why I'm not a big fan of like rules expanding over the course of time. They just create lots of problems.
Hmm.
So generally, you probably want to err on the side of having it be rules as written whenever possible. And if there is some lack of clarity for a particular case, then maybe you might need to get into the intent. But frankly, even if you only went with rules as written ever, it's not ever going to break your game. Like, it might not make the most sense sometimes, and that's where you would probably try to get into what the intent seems to be, but it's not going to break your game. But doing rules as intended or anticipating what the rules as intended are can very easily break your game,
Hmm.
because you start to speak in terms of like, well, the spirit of it seems to be this, and the spirit of it seems like, but then like, why didn't that's not hard to communicate, and so, but plenty of rules just don't jibe with what makes sense in the context of the game, and players will often make a case for that. And also for the sake of consistency, rules as written are just codified. They're just well established, and you might not like the rules as written, but it's not subject to interpretation as much. You just go, I mean, I've gotten down into the linguistic level of like, you know, telling people like, no, the words are this, right?
Hmm.
They You have to explicitly tell them they do not say this. It doesn't say that you can do X. It just says you cannot do Y. And you have a tendency to think of it's either X or Y, but they're not mutually exclusive. You're assuming that because you're like, oh yeah, but like I can't think of a sentence. Like, yeah, but still, it's not preventing you from doing Y. It's just saying that you can only do X or vice versa. So I understand that that's overly rigid sometimes, and it's overly whatever. But I think you're better positioned to be more rigid there for the sake of consistency, because consistency is a big linchpin to fun. Now, if it is coming up too frequently or players are becoming argumentative with you, then that might be worth considering that you're being too rigid, but they don't really have a right to be argumentative with you because you're just going like, look, it's just that's the way it's written. But I've often found that a lot of times when people have these discourses around rules as written and rules as intended, really what's at issue is they just don't know how to read closely.
Yeah.
They're not reading closely. They just kind of rattle it off and they go like, yeah, but like what about this? And it's like, and how many times have I had to say in our game, read it again, like to the player, read it again, slowly this time, and they go, okay, and I'm like, okay, so what does that say? Like, how does that bump up against this other thing? Because the rule itself is hardly ever unclear until it bumps up against something else. And I guess that's what I'm getting at is sometimes the rule makers don't anticipate how it will bump up against something else. And that's really when you do need to get into, well, what is the spirit of this spell seem to be accomplishing?
Hmm.
And should it reasonably trump this other well-established rule? But there's also a rule in D&D that specific trumps general.
Hmm.
So the general rule the general rule is that a natural 20 is a critical hit. That's a general rule. A specific rule for the champion fighter is that you crit on a 19 or 20. So you take that because those rules are in conflict, right? So when they're in conflict, you use the more specific rule. But when they rub up against each other and there's vagary, like they're kind of mutually exclusive or they seem to be negating each other, then that's when you need to get into the intent. Um, is that typically how you rule on something? I mean, that's kind of a more probably likely a more sophisticated schema, but I start with rules as written, read it
Yes.
carefully, read it closely, then go, okay, can it be handled there? If it can't be handled there, can it be handled with specific trumps general? And
Mm,
if not, then okay, what implications would this have of going by rules as written all the time? Would it have major impacts on the game? And the answer is almost always no. It's some nitpicky thing that some player wants to get their way in a particular situation, usually because they're trying to game some sort of
yeah.
rules that like interplay with each other and they're trying to game it in some way. So that if you go with rules as written, it's not going to greatly impact your game. And then as a subset of that, if you can't go with rules as written because it's going to have implications that you don't want to have, then look at the rule and establish whether they're negating each other, and then try to establish what the spirit of the newest thing is, and
Mm.
whether the legacy thing is a more important core rule or the new thing is just not anticipating this legacy rule. That's my hierarchy. I don't know about you.
Yeah, no, I always go with rules as written that I have with me at the time. If this is a very new book or game that you're playing,
Hmm.
and you got to wait for errata to come out, that's something completely different. Or if you have a what they call now live PDFs, like if you bought something off of Drive Through RPG, whenever errata comes out, they will update the PDFs, and then you can just update yours through Drive Through RPG.
Hmm.
Those are great. But rules as written, no matter what in the book that I have in front of me, is always the go-to. Like I said, unless we come to uh, where I was saying before, where if it still doesn't make sense, me and the group will usually come up with a common consensus of what it should be.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the commenters here that I've seen also think that way. Like this one from Steenen that says, Raw is the default for me. If I run into a situation where Raw simply doesn't make sense, not conflicts with how I'm used to run the games, but actually can't be applied consistently or produces absurd results, I discuss it with the whole group and we try to figure out what the author could have in mind and how the rule should be formulated to work. Whatever we end up with, the RAI, as we understand it, becomes binding. I don't play games with rules to ignore the rules. I want the experience the author designed, so I
Yeah.
try to play as close to the original intent as possible. If it doesn't work too often, I put the game away instead of charging it on the fly or changing it on the fly. True.
Yeah, but again, I don't think anyone is like, notice that the questioner didn't give any examples.
Hmm.
Um, and not that examples are necessarily the definition of something, but they illustrate, I'm pretty sure just with a few examples, a lot of times, again, almost every time I've heard someone discuss this, I frequently have to go like, okay, that's not what that says, right? Like you're just not reading the rule closely enough.
Yeah.
And or you're not really understanding that a specific rule trumps a general rule, and you're just trying to get into the intent because you think that a particular thing sounds like it ought to be able to do X and it can't do X. And then sometimes you realize that certain things are just kind of stupid. Like there's certain, like some spells are this way. When you just read them, they seem kind of cool, but then you just realize like, well, the spell's kind of dumb. Like it just doesn't really do anything. Like it's fucking stupid, and I have no
Hmm.
use for it. And it's like, and so that's a clear like the more things that get added on, the more you're going to have this problem. The more recent rules you're using, if you just stick with the core D&D rules, in the player's handbook and the spells that are in the player's handbook and the subclasses that are, you won't ever have this problem. Like pretty much never.
Hmm.
It isn't until you start getting new stuff and it needs to get more nuanced and whatever and detailed that it starts bumping up against legacy rules. And in my estimation, legacy rules win out. But that's why you need to. That's a case for why you would occasionally need to establish the intent of a rule because sometimes something's introduced and it's pretty clear that they are trying to kind of go for a certain dynamic, but frequently things don't really change all that much.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think the most notorious example of this is probably whether things like Eldritch Blast. We had this before, like whether you need to announce the targets
Right.
as an
After
initial cast.
level 5, when you have two of them.
When you have two of them, and people are like, "No, it's a single cast, so you need to target people." It's like, yeah, but
Yeah, but it's two
it's
attack rolls.
it's two attack rolls, right? And it's two attack rolls. They're separate attacks, and so those two things do bump up against each other, and they do. It is unclear because when you
Hmm.
cast a spell, it is a single action, and you choose the targets from the outset. This is the time when I think it's good to kind of get into what the intent is, and it seems like the intent is to give a spellcaster, a ranged spellcaster, the same capability as the multi-attack for a melee character, and in
Yeah.
which case, given that there's nothing that explicitly says that they can't, and there is heavy implications that they can because it's two attack rolls, then why can't they be concurrent? It doesn't
Hmm.
say that they are simultaneous. And other evidence would point to the fact that something like Magic Missile does say that all of the missiles hit
Yeah.
simultaneously.
Hmm.
And so why would that even be necessary to say they hit simultaneously unless the general assumption is that they do not hit simultaneously? So that's similar, right? Like so that's a gambit with Magic Missile. Maybe you only need three missiles to kill someone, and you target all four of them, and three would have done the trick. But that's just the way the spell works, and it's pretty
Yep.
clear about the fact that that's the way the spell works. So yeah, stuff like that does require interpretation, but you're better off erring on the side of what's actually on the page because frequently the implications wouldn't be that big. But in the Eldritch Blast situation, it absolutely is a pretty big deal because you're using that pretty frequently, and the difference between being able to target two enemies if you drop the first enemy and target a second enemy that has more hit points or whatever, then that can have pretty big implications, and so you don't want to hamstring a player in that regard.
Another PC gamer wrote, I think a couple things. Going for raw doesn't make it more consistent and can be more convenient. You'll always be able to remember it since you can just look it up in the rule books. They may not be the most ideal rule, however. If your whole table doesn't like following something by RAW, then it should be more ideal to look into a homebrewed rule. Plus, a homebrew rule could be more quality of life. For new players, I tend to aim towards raw just so they know. Anytime I have a homebrew rule, I write it down so the table is consistent on it. I think of it like a Monopoly game. While it would be more consistent and easier to follow the manual, Monopoly is famous for always having house rules. And sometimes those house rules are more preferred by players.
Yeah, it's a great example of to illustrate why I disagree. Um, there's also a reason that everybody fucking hates Monopoly because your house rules break that shit.
Yes.
They break it. Stop
Yeah.
doing this. Stop doing the whatever the house rules with the money goes into the free parking or whatever. Just stop it. That's not the rule. Like you're fucking shit up. You're fucking the game up way more than you realize you're fucking the game up. And that's how I feel about house rules in D&D. They should be used very very sparingly. And they should be only well thought through. They should touch as little of the rest of the game as possible,
Hmm.
and they should make sense within the context of the game, just like the use object rule and the drinking a potion rule. Like it's the sometimes the intent of the game. Sometimes the intent of the rule actually doesn't make sense within the context of the meta world of the game. Like the potion thing is a great example. Like the intent is to not allow you to get hit points back without spending an action. I get that intent because spells that you cast that give hit points are often an action because getting hit points back is a big thing. But when you bump that up against the fact that it's just like you're just drinking like 5 ounces of fluid,
Mm-hmm.
that's all you're doing.
Yeah.
That's a whole action? Like, that's a whole action to just quaff back 5 ounces of fluid.
Yeah.
Then why isn't it a whole action to do a whole number of other things that are in the same ballpark that just breaks the meta, like the meta narrative of the game? It's like this is really, really world breaking. So actually, the author's intent there is the rule maker's intent is kind of stupid because it, again, I've said this before, like a use object, often in a published adventure or whatever, if a use object does a bunch of damage to an enemy, like, you know, you're using a ballista or something, then it takes your full action. But then sometimes it doesn't take your full action. And it's like, that shouldn't make much of a difference unless the actual mechanics of something call for it. Yes, getting on a ballista and pulling back and aiming and poof can conceivably take your full action, but I always use the flipping a lever. If a flipping a lever just unlocks something, in most adventures, it's just going to be like, oh, you can just flip it and unlock the door as a use object. And you're like, okay, cool, I flip it and unlock. But like, what if it dumped 1,000 pounds of rocks on a dragon and caused 28 D8 to him? Well, then that would be an action to suddenly flip the same fucking lever, and that makes no sense. It's like if it were a light switch and it electrocuted someone in the other room as opposed to turning on a light, it would take an action suddenly. It makes no sense. And so the intent sometimes doesn't even enter into it for me if I'm considering a house rule.
Yeah. I like that Hey No Swearing writes, as a young whippersnapper, I used to be a lot more lenient. I've since realized that I don't need to make shit up anymore because there's rules for everything that have been discussed to death. Make things so much simpler to run. Everyone just consistently does what the book says they do, and we can strategize properly and not get bogged down arguing over what's allowed.
Yeah.
Good job, Hey
That's
No
the
Swearing.
key. That's the key. Don't get bogged down arguing about like what the implications are. Like the very key thing is I think Matt he's proselytized this idea for years now. It's like just make a ruling that seems like it makes sense at the time. Think on it a little bit more. Perhaps look up what other people are saying about it. And generally speaking, when you look up what other people are saying about it, you will realize that you're misreading something or
Yep.
misinterpreting something in some way. You're
Yep.
forgetting about some other rule that like comes into play here. So just make a ruling on the spot that kind of seems appropriate for what it is you're doing. Don't go house rule and shit until you can get some clarity. Think on it, read the book, and read both rules very clearly. Go on Reddit or wherever. See if fucking Jeremy Crawford put a tweet out about it or
Yep.
whatever, because he does that sometimes. Well, he doesn't anymore. He doesn't work there anymore.
Well, not
does he?
anymore, but he
Yeah.
used to. It's still
But
out
he
there.
used to. He used to. He's very responsive and very. And then even I've even read some responses from him where I'm like, that seems stupid. Like I don't.
Yeah, right?
He just said that was the intent of the rule, and it's like, yeah, I don't care. It works better this way, right?
Yeah, I'd say especially if you're in the moment, like you're in a very intense scene, or if you're in a combat and you don't want to slow down or lose that momentum, yeah, pause it or don't pause it. Just make a ruling real quick, come back to it afterwards when, right after you might take a 5-minute break, look it up real quick, be like, hey, for next time I fucked up. We should have done this instead.
Yeah, I mean, I would just take a note of it. I wouldn't even come back to it that session. I would just take
Yeah.
a note of everything that you need to go look up and then spend a little bit of prep work time on all the things that are maybe ambiguous and try to get some clarity on them in some capacity, because otherwise you're just going to be kind of house ruling things and just kind of flying by the seat of your pants and just anything that saps the energy out of a scene, and nothing saps the energy out of a scene by like long-winded debates about the rules. Don't get Matt started on this. Matt doesn't like anything more than like 8 seconds of like like just no, that's not what it is. We're gonna do it this way. It's like, well, I don't know actually how that would work. Let me read it a second here. Matt's like, no, just make a ruling and let's go. Stop it. You're ruining the scene. But yeah, like if you can't get to the bottom of it in about 15 or 25 seconds, then just table it
Yeah.
make a note and go look it up later, and then come back here at the start of each session, just be like, okay, here are things I went and looked up, and I was wrong or I was right, or yes, 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 or this is how we're doing it from moving forward, or whatever. So
I know another commenter here, Schmo. I think this person kind of defines me because they say depends highly on the context, but generally default rules as written, with room for rules as intended if there's some strange unintended interaction. Is the player trying to abuse the rules as written? Then I'll probably go rules as intended. Is the player trying to argue for something that's clearly not the rules as intended? I'll probably go with rules as written. Am
Yeah.
I using the rule? RAWTHIW, rules as whatever the hell I want. Good.
I'm in that camp too, but you need to be cautious with that, because if the players feel like you're just interpreting things to get the results that you want, it removes their agency, and then they
Yeah.
start to feel frustrated because they feel like you're conspiring against them. Why
Yep.
don't you just rewrite the whole rule book in whatever way you want? It's like, I'm with you. I don't like players trying to abuse the rules, but if a player's found a loophole in a rule that seems perfectly reasonable and I can't find a way around it, I can't just say, well, that clearly isn't the intent. Like, I don't know how many times I've ever, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I hardly ever use that, like, excuse, like, well, that's clearly not the intent of the rule. Like, I usually find, like, no, let me think through this. Like, what are the other rules that are at play that I'm not thinking about, right? Like, this happened, it happened on a few different occasions, and actually it was one of those things that sometimes you're making assumptions that you don't realize you're making. I caught Matt up on this in the quiz when remember where I got you with, you're like, oh, you wouldn't be able to do that because you couldn't cast another spell unless it was a cantrip that had the casting time of a
Yeah.
bonus action. And I was like, actually, none of that is relevant because you're not using the casting a spell, you're using the use magic item action. And he was like, "Oh, right, that's a separate action."
Yeah.
He's like, it's not you're not using the cast a spell action, and so you're using the use device, like use magic device action, which is a separate action, because otherwise players that don't have the spell casting option to them would not be able to cast spells from an item. Like a fighter couldn't cast a spell from a magic item that he
Yep.
can clearly use. And so, yeah, but it's like sometimes you make assumptions like that and you don't realize you're making assumptions like that.
All right. Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of this episode, unless you got anything to end with there, David.
No, I got off on a bit of a jag there, but I think my point is made.
Yeah, you jag off a lot.